Thanks so much for having me, and it's really great to meet you, Henry, who it turns out doesn't really need much of an introduction in this crowd. I wanted to ask you about, first off, just about your military experience. And I've noticed that I'd like to talk to you about the philosophy of how you think about discussing it. Drew, who just stood up from Wove, for example, we were talking about this earlier. Do you lead with that? In what conversations do you bring it up? Do you wonder how that's going to play against the civilian-military divide we have in this country? But first off, tell me what your military experience did for you in your career.
Yeah, so I had a pretty unconventional, I think, military experience. When I was 18, my father was in the Army, and so I joined the Marines. I was trying to pay for school, get away from home, sort of all the kind of teenage stuff at the time. So I joined the Marines in '94. I went to Parris Island. I joined in the reserves because I wanted to go to college and do the GI Bill thing. So I joined the reserves. I couldn't quite pay for college at the time, so I ended up going for a couple of years of active duty. Went to SOI in Lejeune and did some of that, and then went back to University of Michigan. Finally saved up enough, and I joined at the time what was called Platoon Leaders Course, which is sort of the Marine Corps version of ROTC. And I went to OCS in Quantico and was planning to become an officer, but this was in 2000. And I was a math major with a minor in computer science, and I remember my first offer. And ROTC is a contractual obligation to become an officer. OCS, Platoon Leaders Course, is a voluntary. And so I remember my first offer in 2000 to be a software engineer. I could pay back my entire GI Bill loan on the signing bonus, and I still regret it today that I did that. I think I would have really enjoyed having been a Marine Corps officer for 4 years after college, but I ended up going into tech, and I stayed in the reserves for another 6 years, and then I stopped, and that was my full experience. How much do you find yourself applying things that you learned there in your career now? Yeah, there's something really magical. I remember this really well in OCS. We were in. I was at college, and all my friends, we used to train together in the mornings, and we went to like this obstacle course thing for college kids, and we crushed it, right? We were better than everybody else. Like our team of 6 could do everything better, and there's just something magical about how military could really teach you to work in unison in a way that doesn't exist in civilian life. I think the difference, though, I think what a lot of military people, including myself, have in the transition from military life to civilian life, particularly I think this is true in entrepreneurship, is in the military, you're really judged by the worst thing you do. And in civilian life and entrepreneurship, you're judged by the best thing you do. And it really is a flip. You can be really bad at a lot of things as an entrepreneur, but if you're really good at something, they'll forgive you for your mistakes, which isn't true in the military. And I do think one of the challenges that I've had is how do I stop playing defense, because that's what I was trained to do in the military, of not making mistakes. How do I get okay with making mistakes and play offense and double down on what makes me special? Because in the military, being special is not a good thing, but in entrepreneurship, it is.
Huh, that's great. I won't ask you what the worst thing was, because we've all got our stories. And with veterans that you meet in this space, what do you see them doing right with their military experience, and what do you see them maybe not handling as well?
Yeah, I think leadership is a real gap in leadership, I think, in general, but I certainly think in tech. I love seeing sort of military leadership being brought into the civilian world, and the way that I often describe it is, leadership is really about being someone that other people want to win. And there's something special about what you're taught, I think, in the military about inspiring people to follow you. It's really that you grab people around you that want you to win, And that's really true, I think, in entrepreneurship. Like if you're the founder, CEO of a company and you've hired your first 10 people, your first 20 people, your first 100 people, the most important cultural element that you can give them is that they want you to win. And every day they come in going, I want the person I'm working for to win. And if you get that, magic starts to happen. And if you don't, you're swimming against the current. It gets really hard.
Yeah. I'm interested in whether you think sort of leading with military experience, where that is an asset and where it isn't, because after the all-volunteer force sort of became the norm in this country, it's a very tiny percentage of the country that understands, even with the wars post 9/11 and the country being a little bit more involved, it's a tiny part of the country that understands the military experience. It can be off-putting sometimes. There's a language gap sometimes. Have you seen people who are coming out of the military who are leading with that experience too much in their interactions, or what do you think of that?
Yeah, I guess I've always had a complicated relationship with talking about military service, and maybe it's also my generation. I think the world has changed and gotten better, but I remember, I was in college in the 90s and walking on campus in uniform, and people would yell "baby killer." And Vietnam happened 20 years before. I was born, right? Vietnam had already finished, and that's still kind of. And I also went to Ann Arbor, which is like the Berkeley of the Midwest. So don't overfit on one school, but at least where I grew up, joining the military was a handicap. It meant something was wrong. Like you joined the military because you didn't have better options, and I don't know if that's still true. It's a generation ago. Obviously, I think San Francisco is probably not the most, forward-thinking when it comes to the military and veterans. But I hope it's changed, and I feel like the world's moving in that direction.
Yeah. Just in the audience, how many of you served pre 9/11? Okay, and the rest are post 9/11, I guess. I guess I've divided it up. Math isn't my strong suit, but okay.
Yeah, 9/11 changed a lot of it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely you can see a cultural difference between people who, for example, joined the Marines and thought they might be seeing the world and going abroad, and then people who joined and were on a constant deployment tempo. And everybody raised their hand, no judgment, but it's a totally different experience for sure. Yeah. With building Carta, tell me. I guess this crowd is someone who already understands what Carta is and why it was necessary. Do you find yourself no longer having to explain what it is you do, or is it still something that you have to talk sort of?
Yeah, so when I go to founder events and I love going to founder events. It's like one of my favorite things to talk to founders and CEOs and about their companies and their ideas. It's like it's inspiring. But I think at this point, I used to go because it used to be a sales, exercise, and I would tell everybody about why they should get on Carta. And now it's mostly a support exercise. People complain if something's wrong or something went wrong. So I spend a lot of time talking to founders about Carta. They're all at this point aware of it. Hopefully, many of them are customers, and so it's a great opportunity for me to just get customer feedback about what people like about Carta and what they don't like, and how we can get better at it.
Gentlemen, real quick, apologies. This is Tim back here. We have some people that are hard of hearing in this audience.
Oh, okay.
So please, if you all could put your mic
mic
closer. Yeah, the audio is my fault, but if you all could help the audience. Thank you, sir.
No, sorry about that. And Tim, I know we've started a little bit late, so I'll ask questions for the regular half an hour, and then I'm really interested in hearing your all's questions because you guys know what you want to know much better than I do. So we'll get to audience questions soon. But when is Carta going to be something? So this crowd all knows what Carta does. I'm a public radio reporter. I had to Google it pretty hard, and I listened to the podcast that you all produce, which was very helpful for me learning what you do. I personally don't need a capitalization table yet. Someday, maybe. But when is it going to be relevant in my life, Carta?
I hope in the next 10 years. So for those that don't know, we're kind of, just a quick intro to Carta. We launched in January 2014, so I incorporated in 2012, so it's been 10 years or so for me. It started with this idea of cap table management. Today, fast forward, we're about 2,000 employees, about 300 million in bookings, and the whole thesis for us has been, can you get more people off the what we call the debt stack? So I have this view that labor over time, has evolved, right? It started with sort of feudalism and serfdom. I would say we're now in the era of payroll, where people rent their time for money. And I think the future is ownership, where you work for ownership and productive assets, presumably your own company. And my favorite adage, the future is here, is just not evenly distributed. And so that started obviously in tech. So 20 years ago, actually, even 15 years ago, it was pretty unheard of to get equity in a tech company. And then a couple companies started doing it. It was actually the Fairchild Semiconductor team that started doing it, and then they got all the best engineers, so all the engineers wanted to go to them, and then everybody had to follow suit, and then it became a norm, right? It was a stable equilibrium where nobody got equity in the companies they worked for, and then it became a stable equilibrium when everybody did. And that happened in tech, and it hasn't expanded outside of tech. And part of our thesis is the reason it hasn't become mainstream is just because of the friction. It's administratively challenging to do, because this was all done on paper before Carta, and Carta turned this into software, right? We put equity into the cloud, and the thesis has always been, if you could make equity and ownership as simple, cheap, and easy as payroll, everybody would get equity and payroll, and in 20 years, it would be odd. It will seem strange to people in 20 or 30 years that we went to work for a company and all we got was cash. Like they just won't understand it. They're like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? Why would you just rent your time for cash and not get anything of permanent value out of that? And I think why that's important is that sort of the rich get richer, and the reason why the rich get richer is that economic growth compounds exponentially, right? It's 3% growth, GDP growth compounds exponentially, and equity returns all compound exponentially, but cash doesn't. Cash is a debt product, right? Debt accumulates linearly. And so another way to think about the era of payroll is that workers today are on the debt stack of a company, and the owners of a company are on the equity stack. And because equity accumulates exponentially, outsized returns and economic growth go to the owners of the company, and everybody else just sees growth in wages, which never keeps up with economic growth. And so our job is to take more people off the debt stack of these companies and put them into the ownership stack.
Don't they then also assume some of the risk? I mean, it reminds me a little bit of people talking about, well, why don't you take your Social Security and play the market with it, which smart people you guys would do great with. I would lose my shirt, and it terrifies me.
Yeah, and so we have a policy team, and we work in DC a lot and try to push sort of more progressive policies around ownership, and that is the Democratic push. So the Republican side of the House is very much, yes, create more owners in the world. Like, this is a good thing. We should get more people owning companies that they work for. The Democrats worry the other way. So their argument is, hey, it's a trick, right? Cash, people need that to pay rent and buy food and do all of those things. And you as evil corporate capitalists will pay them less in cash because you're going to promise them this equity that doesn't mean anything. And I think one of the great challenges that we have in DC is to help Democrats understand that, like, ownership is not an evil capitalist construct. It's actually like this wonderful thing that creates more value. For some reason, they think capitalism is good. Like, it's okay for people to buy stock, just don't earn it. And I think we have to help shape that narrative on the Democratic side of the party, of the House.
It sounds like, I mean, this is another question I was going to ask you, and it sounds like this might have answered it, is I know a lot of people, when they're leaving the military, will be really in search of a mission something that could feel that important again, something that can feel that clear sense of purpose again. And so it sounds like in a way you've got that mission with this philosophy you're talking about. How would you advise or people on finding that mission or finding that purpose in what they're doing post-military?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I'm very lucky that I kind of stumbled upon this idea that suddenly seemed to have broader impact. I think there's a lot of founders that are very pragmatic. Like, hey, I found a problem in the market, I built a tool, I sold it, and I'm just building a business. And I think that's wonderful and fantastic. And I think in the early days I felt that way. I always thought Carta would be a lifestyle business. I thought we'd be like 20 or 30 employees, generate cash flows, and that was just kind of like what I did. I got very lucky that Carta is one of these wonderful companies that the more problems you get to solve, the more problems you solve, the more problems you get to solve. Like I'm not sure what the inverse of peeling an onion is, but it's like that. It's like every time we do something, it's like, hey, we can do even more. And it just continues. We have no shortage of ideas, and I think that's probably, if you want to be a founder that sort of creates sort of a $10 million solid cash flow business, like you probably need one idea, and it kind of you can solve a problem and you can get paid to solve that problem. I think if you want to do something more ambitious, you have to be sort of this fountain of ideas, because all of these ideas compound together to build something greater. And the analogy that I use a lot with my product managers is it's sort of like in music. There's so many one-hit wonders, right? Somebody created one song and it was great, and but they never did anything after that. And it's that rare musician that can do 2 songs or 3 songs that make it on the Billboard charts. But then it's really these generational musicians that can do album after album. That's amazing, and that's really, really hard. And so that's the real challenge: is can you be an entrepreneur? Can you be a fountain of ideas that consistently produces not just one-hit wonders, but singles and albums over time to build something really, really ambitious?
I don't know if this would apply to you so much, because it seemed like your product came along and replaced. I think you've said that it replaced FedEx as a method to do what was needed. So it was maybe one of those things like Lyft or Uber, where you're like, okay, this is obviously better than hailing a cab. Everyone start doing this. But in terms of convincing people to accept a new idea, I'm very attached to my FedEx. I like using FedEx. Why should I try your new, different thing? I mean, for those in our audience who are trying to do that, what advice do you have? What lessons learned?
Yeah, so I think I encourage founders to think about what type of their company is in two ways, sort of two buckets. So one is, are you a new market company? Are you creating something new that doesn't exist in the world? Or two, are you displacing something that does, right? Are you going after the incumbent with something better? And the analogy I always use is like, I used to compete a lot with payroll companies, Gusto, Zenefits, Rippling, like in recruiting employees. And they would ask me, why should I join Carta instead of go to Gusto? Or, and I would say, well, it depends on the type of company you want to work for or you want to join. Some companies are displacing something that exists today that has, infinite TAM. Like you have line of sight to $1 billion in revenue. If you build a better payroll system, or if you build a better database, like you can sell your way to $1 billion in revenue. Like that's very clear. The risk or the question is, can you out-execute everybody else that's doing the same thing, right? You are displacing an incumbent. Carta is a little bit different. There was no market for cap table software when we did it. There is no secondary private market. Like none of these things exist anymore. What we're trying to do is make something exist that doesn't. And I use this analogy where it's like in these execution and displacement type companies, these are execution games. Like, hey, can I out-execute everybody else? But I know exactly what to do. And if you join that company, they know what to do. Like, here's the playbook. Here's what we do. you fit into this highly tuned execution machine. You're one piece of the puzzle, and you execute. If you come to Carta, we're like that sort of misfit band that's kind of hacking through the jungle, with a machete, and we don't really know where we're going. Like, we kind of have an idea, but we don't have a map. Maybe we have a compass, we have a direction, but we have to chart our own path as we go, because we don't actually know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I call it sort of execution companies versus innovation companies. And I think one of the things I encourage people to think about when they're building out their strategy is, are you an execution company taking out an incumbent? And if so, then the question is, how do you do that? How do you out-execute the incumbents? If you're an innovation company that's creating something new that hasn't existed in the world, how do you convince the world that they need something that doesn't exist? Right? That's the hardest problem in these innovation companies.
Thanks. I'm going to get to audience questions soon because I know you guys have plenty. I want to ask you something more personal, and I want to commend you on having been open about your own struggles with bipolar. And I asked you before we got up here if it was okay to talk about, because it's a personal thing, but I know you've been public about it, and I know that for many people in the veterans community, there is, for all the time you're in the military, you have to hide what struggles you're having. They say that culture is changing, but it hasn't necessarily changed when you're in the military. And even after military life, and I imagine in this world, appearing strong at all times is still sort of the cult idea. And so I wanted to ask you about that and why you were open about that and how it's going.
Yeah, so I was first diagnosed as bipolar, I think, when I was 21 or 22, and I didn't believe it. It just felt like, kind of a quack doctor thing. And if there's a stigma about mental health in civilian life, there's a real stigma in the military around it. And I think I didn't believe it, and I also, what do you say to your platoon leader? Hey, I'm bipolar, just heads up. It's a very, it's like, you don't really quite know.
Don't worry, but.
Yeah. And it's something you can get, medical discharge over at the time. I don't know if that's still true, but at the time, definitely. So it's like something.
Undeployable, at least, I would think.
Totally. And so I think I didn't believe it. I also think I didn't want to believe it because it changed a lot of the things in my life. And I think it always a little bit haunted me. And then, fast forward 20 years later in my early 40s, I always knew something was wrong with me. And then I saw somebody and they're like, you're definitely bipolar. You need to, stop avoiding it. And I think there was something liberating about it. I wish I had taken more charge of it earlier in my life. But to be able to kind of name it and understand it, I think was really helpful. And if there's one thing I wish the military could get better about is removing the stigma around mental health, because it's such an issue. Even when you talk about it now, mental health for veterans, it's talked about a lot more, but it's talked about sort of post, after service, but it's not talked about during. And being in the military is hard. It's challenging. And I wish there was more conversation around that.
Yeah. Well, I want to commend you for being open about it, because it's, I think, the way things are moving, but there's a long way to go. And you've also made part of your mission at your company sort of transparency and pay equity, but as you know well, you've also been beaten up by the press about not delivering on that. And I know in the press we love hypocrisy much more than we love the actual fault. As if you're trying to do something about it and then not succeeding, then that's, they'll go after you. But I want to ask you about this. Have you hired a woman onto your board yet? And I think at some point you said you were going to have 1 in 5 on your board would be women. How's that going?
Yeah, it's going well. We have Barbara on the board. She's fantastic. I do think there's this sort of weird thing that the media does that I don't completely understand why, but the media does love going after people who are trying. succeed or fail. And it's not just us. It's like any founders that are trying to do something, and if they see weakness, they go after them. I think the media is horrible to female founders and CEOs. Like, they disproportionately go after them. I really wish. It's really unfortunate. You never read articles about supporting entrepreneurs, like in the media. Like, it's all very negative. It's very negative on tech. And I think the more successful people are, the more media wants to go after you. So I guess I have a complicated relationship with the media as well. I think I grew up, my father was like, trust the media. Like, journalists, they're the highest integrity people. This is what they do.
I could tell him a thing or two.
Yeah, and my experience, having seen what media writes about me and Carta, and actually knowing what actually happened, the integrity is in short supply in the media.
And how is your company doing in terms of pay equity on between men and women?
Yeah, we've always done great. Like, I don't think we've actually ever had any issues there. I think the bigger thing that we're going after is pay equity in the ecosystem. And the whole thesis and why we care about this, I think probably disproportionately, is, again, if you think of compensation includes cash and ownership. The problem is if you overpay or underpay somebody, 10% on cash. Like, it's not good. Like, that's a bad thing, and all of that stuff, and it should get fixed. But it's relatively minor relative to equity. If you pay somebody less in equity, and all of a sudden that's a winning company, it's not $10,000. It's not $20,000. It's millions of dollars, and that gets recycled into them being investors and venture capitalists. Like, it creates a downstream effect, and so we're really big. We publish a report every year on not cash equity, but on stock ownership equity, and that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about.
And so, in terms of your goals on that, your stated goals of having equity and having 1 in 5 members of your board be female, where are you on that?
Yeah, so we've got Barbara on our board, and we're constantly thinking about, especially if we go public, like what the board composition looks like.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to comment on. I know that there are several cases of people who say they were wrongfully terminated, et cetera. Do you have anything to say about those?
Not really.
Okay, that's surprising. All right. Well, now I think it's probably time to open up to the audience. And are we going to have someone with a microphone moving around? Great. So there's the closest hand to you over there, Eric.
Hi, good morning. I'm Aaron Stachel. I'm a partner at First Mile Ventures and a happy Carta fund admin client. And in our first fund, a lot of companies use Carta. In our second fund, all of them did. And it's really become a standard. But just a couple of weeks ago, we had the first sort of one of your upstart competitors. Somebody wanted to use them instead and save a few bucks. And I'm curious what that's meant for you as a leader, going from starting a company, convincing people to use cap table software, growing and kind of dominating that space, and now sort of defending it. How have you had to kind of change your focus as a leader to kind of manage over all those cycles?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's a great question. I actually just came in this morning from Napa, and we're at I was there for 3 days with an exec offsite. So we brought all the execs, and it's actually one of the topics that we were thinking about. Is like I was really lucky. From 2014 to 2020, nobody cared about cap table management. Like, there was no competition. Nobody wanted it. It was just like everybody thought it was a dumb idea. And then in the last 2 years, like, there's a new cap table startup, every month. It seems like that's coming in, and so we're not used to competition, and we hate it. If you haven't seen sort of Peter Thiel's like "Competition is for Losers" video, like we follow that, we follow that philosophy very closely. Like, we really try to go after. We are a new markets company. Like, we we try to innovate in doing new things that haven't been done before rather than trying to compete with something that has been done before. I think, to be very specific, our view of the world is that cap table will become commoditized if it hasn't already. And our job is to find new products and services to decommoditize the stuff that goes around the cap table. One of our existential threats and our challenges is, we knew this from the beginning. You know, we're about $300 million in revenue. About 200 of that comes out of the cap table business, and the other 100 comes out of the fund admin business. We knew that there's a limit to the amount of cap table software you can sell, right? And maybe it's 300 million in revenue, maybe it's 500, but there's at some point where we're going to run out of oxygen. And that's going to get accelerated with the commoditization of cap tables, because it's just accounting. There's nothing special about cap table management. It's just accounting. And so if you fast forward, does cap tables become a feature of something else? Or can cap tables stand as does it deserve to stand as a standalone business, or is it a feature of a broader platform? Because I think in the 2000s we went through sort of the bundling of enterprise software with the SAPs and the Oracles and all of those things, and then in the last decade we've gone through the unbundling of vertical SaaS solutions, right? So you got Coupa and Gusto and Zenefits and all of these things, and I think the world is now transitioning back to a bundling era. And you'll see a lot of that this year, and you'll see these HRIS platforms that are building out full people functions. All of the planning, products that were point solutions are now becoming Office of the CFO platforms. That's a huge market with, you look at like Brex and Trip Actions and spend management and all of those things that everyone's broadening their offering. And the existential threat that we keep thinking about is what happens to cap tables. 10 years from now, is cap tables a feature of something bigger? And what is that bigger thing? Does it become part of HRIS? Does it become part of wealth management? Does it become part of an exchange? And I think we don't have a clear crystal answer on that yet. We're thinking through that, but we're absolutely convinced that if all we do is bet on our cap table software, will eventually decay. And so what do we have to bring to market that makes cap table a feature of something bigger and better? So that we don't get eaten up by some of these other larger platforms, so that we can stay independent. And it's a long-winded way of saying, I don't have a great answer for you, but we're actually thinking about this a lot right now.
Who else has got a question? Here we go.
Hi, Jeremy Smith, the CEO of Civitech. We've been using Carta for 3.5 years. It's very valuable for us. I have a personal bias towards making sure as many employees as possible have equity. So Carta's been very valuable for us from the beginning, but it creates, not Carta, but this approach has all these kind of administrative hassles. In particular, you mentioned you have this think tank and policy arm in DC. Any chance that 83B can be gotten rid of?
So do you want to get rid of it, like just eliminate 83B?
Just like, why is that rule there? Where you're talking about the 30 days, it's the only thing you can't fix.
Got it, right. Make it better, yeah. So we actually just went through a process where in the Biden infrastructure, the $3 billion thing, they wanted to get rid of 83B, and they also wanted to get rid of QSBS, which I don't know if people know what QSBS is. If you don't, let me give you a 30-second pitch. You definitely should, especially for founders and early employees. It's a huge tax break that you get as an early shareholder in these startups. So please look into it. Do it for your own personal stuff. If you're creating trust for your kids, take advantage of QSBS. If you're not sure what it is, Google it or call your Carta support person, and they can help you. They can help you figure this out. And so we had to protect it. I agree. 83B is completely the system is really broken. The funny story about 83B is. We worked with the IRS to make it electronic so that you could just click a button and we would take care of it electronically for you. So you didn't have to worry about it. And the dream was that, to your point, it wasn't like if you forgot you out of 30 days, you were like out of luck. It's like you didn't even have to think about it. We'll just do it for you because it costs nothing. All it costs is the time to write the letter, and we'll write it for you, stamp it for you and send it for you, and you don't have to do anything. And we did that, and then the IRS won't take electronic signatures. And so we've been lobbying for 4 years to get the IRS to take electronic signatures on 83B, and haven't made progress. A long-winded way of saying 83B. I hope it stays, but hopefully we can shape it so that it makes more sense for people.
We over here? We got one over here, and then we won't forget this fellow over here.
Hi, Andrew Glaze, CEO of WealthStack. We help veteran CEOs get access to capital. I've actually got two questions for you. So I serve on some public boards, and they're mostly traditional legacy media assets, so nothing high growth and sexy like this. And there isn't Carta there at all. And so what are you guys doing on the public slow growth side sort of thing? And then completely different question. I'm very curious about how you've grown your organization from a veteran employee perspective, and I'd be very curious to hear about what are the programs you've implemented, who have you partnered with, do you track the percentages of veterans, and kind of how have you built that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So on the public side, so this is also prescient. We actually talked about this yesterday. We had a board. I have a monthly board call with my board, and we just talked about this yesterday about our public strategy and the thesis of Carta. If you actually, you can look up our seed or Series A deck. I published it online, which was a mistake because now we have all these startups copying. But I did that a long time ago. And in the seed deck, I said, look, we're going to start with this cap table thing, and then we're going to do private stock markets, and we're going to do this, that, and the other, and then we're going to be the on-ramp to IPO. We're going to own the pipeline to IPO. The IPOs of 2027 are Series B companies on Carta today. They're on Carta today. We're going to own that ramp to going public. And then when we take them public, we're going to then, all of that illiquid private equity that they have will suddenly become liquid. And it's going to drop into the Carta account, and then we're going to do wealth management for them. And we're going to be this amazing, we're going to own the next generation of wealth, right? The next 100 years of wealth is going to be created through tech, and we earn the right to capture all of that wealth. So that was always the dream. And then we ran into Morgan Stanley. And I was actually in New York last week meeting with them, and they just bought E-Trade for $8 billion and Solium, which is one of our public competitors, for $1 billion. And they're putting billions of dollars into basically my idea. And they're building this huge wealth management
They're not
business.
crediting you or paying you a commission, I suppose.
Yeah, they, we get excited because we're at $300 million in revenue. They put $1 trillion of new AUM every 3 years into their coffers. Like it's a scale I can't even imagine. And so we've gotten to know them, and I'm a cocky founder, and I can take on anybody. And I walked out of Morgan Stanley going, we're going to lose to these guys. They're really good at what they do. So my long-winded way of saying is, I don't know what we're going to do in the public world. To my earlier point, can we take out the incumbent? And when you look at what Morgan Stanley is doing, I don't think we can. And so what do we do instead, right? How do we find growth when one of our great growth vectors is taken from us? And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. To your second question, I'm embarrassed to say we don't track it. We do have a ERG, Employee Resource Group, for veterans, and they get together, and I talk to them informally, but we don't track this as a statistic.
Craig Cummins from Moonshots Capital. We're proud investors in Carta alongside some partners, so keep crushing, please. I work at a capital factory in Austin, Texas, so bullet point one is I really think you gotta have a team there. It's that's where all the startups are. It makes too much sense to me. All right. Number two, swag game is very strong from Carta across the board. I don't know if that's contributed to the growth, but I've noticed it, and we've internalized it in Moonshots Capital. The question is, how are you feeling about Carta X?
Yeah. So I've known Josh for years from Capital Factory. I lived in Austin, so right after college, that job I talked about was in Austin, Texas. I lived there for 9 years. I even named my son Austin, so I love Austin. And Capital Factory is a great thing. And I worked at a company called Trilogy, which has a lot of network. Josh worked at Trilogy. It's a big network in Austin, Texas. So, in our swag game, thank you. We've actually, it's interesting if you think about marketing. We have a new CMO that we put in a couple years ago, or a year and a half ago, and her view is very micro marketing versus mass. When you think of marketing, most people think of press and big stories and big paid and huge budgets and advertising and things like that. And she's taken a very targeted approach where instead of having a budget for big massive events and spreads and magazines and newspaper pages and things, she'll just take people Carta users to dinner. And our budgets go into these small events and give them swag and make it very intimate. So I'm glad it's working. It's actually by design. So Carta X, those that don't know Carta X is our name for our Carta liquidity or private stock market, which was always kind of the dream. The two dreams we had was own the pipeline to IPO and asset management, and then build a private stock market. It's not going great. It's a tough market to crack. There's so many differences between the public and private markets. Like, for example, in the public markets, price is set by the last buyer. In the private markets, price is set by the first buyer. All of you know this if you've done a term sheet, right? The first buyer, sets a term sheet, and then you fill in the round, and which is the opposite of how public markets work, where the price can float as demand picks up or demand dies. So there's so many idiosyncratic problems with it. And then right now, the bid-ask spread in these secondary markets is so far apart, it's hard to cross trades. So I'm hoping we can solve the liquidity problem. I've been working on this for 8 years, and it's been, I guess, my Moby Dick. I've been chasing this problem for years. We have a team working on it. It's been very frustrating. I would say, some things work at Carta, some things don't work at Carta. This is the biggest one that hasn't worked at Carta. But we're stubborn and persistent, and we'll continue to work on it.
I think we've got time for a question or two more. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks for joining us, Henry. John Deniston. Quick question. You mentioned in your remarks that you were interested, you were originally thinking this was going to be a lifestyle business, and I assume at some point that changed because you took investment, and I'm just curious if you could take us through that decision point, what that journey was like, and then ultimately your decision to take investment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there was something that happened, I think, somewhere around that Series A, Series B timeframe where the business started working. For those of you that are sort of pre-product market fit, the world completely changes when you get to product market fit. Everything you do changes. It's a completely different mindset. It's a different company. Everything's different, right? When you're pre-product market fit, you're iterating quickly. You're learning. You're trying to figure out how to build something people want, right? That's it. And it's just very iterative. You're very lean. Time is your enemy. You've got to make sure you have enough time to figure this out. And so it's a very hustle type mindset. And then when you get to product market fit, the world turns upside down. Now you'll pay for growth at all costs. You rinse and repeat, and you're not trying to experiment anymore because experimenting's bad. You want to actually do things to scale very quickly. And so we had product market fit. I would say we started really feeling strong product market fit in 2015. I would say 2014 we started seeing people wanted what we bought and they were willing to pay for it, and it was really exciting. But in 2015, you could just feel the market was pulling the product out of us. And just as an anecdote, what does that mean? How do you know? And one example was 1 month we switched from I can't remember, but it was Ring Central or one of these phone services. We switched from one to another. and we messed it up so that, when the customer called and said, press 1 to talk to sales, press 2 to talk to services or support, whatever it was, we messed up, and if you pressed 1 to talk to sales, it would just hang up on you. And we didn't know for a month. And that's product market fit. And the only way we found out was because somebody went in through a support channel and was like, I'm trying to give you my money, but I can't find a salesperson to take it. Can you give me the software? And that's when I knew. I was like, we have something special here. And so then when it became this thing like, wow, something's really working, and then if we solve this problem, we can do liquidity, and we can do pipeline to IPO, and we can create more owners, and all these things, then I don't know, it just became dreamlike, right? You're just like, wow, I can do so much in the world, but I need cash to do it. And then you sign a term sheet.
For one more question.
Hi, Pat Cronin, CEO of Vanta. So one of the things that I was curious to hear your thoughts on is back to the secondary markets for options. One of the things that I experienced as an employee at a startup that was maybe not quite early stage, more like Series A, when I left the company, I had the decision to buy or not buy, right? I had to exercise them. And I think that's, in a way, kind of a trick, right? And now as a founder, I feel similarly, as I grow, am I tricking my employees, knowing that a lot of these employees won't actually buy and exercise their options and will never receive any sort of ownership. So is there sort of a thought to option buying, trading, selling for the later stage employees who are just as motivated and feel the same excitement to get the shares for the first time as I did, and then realize, oh shit, this is gonna cost me $50,000, right?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question, because I think about this, I've been thinking about these problems for years. So there's like two problems. One is, how do you help an employee exercise options if they can't afford it? And most companies today have a 30 to 90 day PTEP, which means post-termination exercise period. If they don't exercise within 90 days, they lose their stock options. And it's incredibly punitive. And the world shouldn't exist that way. You should just have, there's nothing magical. Well, the magic about 90 days is that's when you lose your what's called ISO status. So these options change and become what's called non-qualified. So you lose your tax advantage. The problem is the lawyers, when they started doing this, they didn't want to deal with the ISO to NSO conversion because they were doing this all by paper. So they just told founders, you know what, just cancel the options at 90 days, and then you don't have to pay for us to re-grant these options. As a non-qual and do all this paperwork and legal stuff, it's just easier. And so then it became a standard, right? It's like, why did 4 years and 1 year cliff become a standard? It was because some lawyer was like, let's just do 4 years and I don't want to worry about it. And now that's what everybody does. And so everybody does 90 days, but there's no reason to. And so like at Carta, we actually don't have that. We actually tie PTEP to vesting. So if you stay a year, you have a year to exercise. If you stay 4 years, you have 4 years to exercise. It's a little more challenging if you have CFOs because the CFO has to carry that liability on the books. So do this before you get one. Otherwise, they'll argue with you about it. But it's the right thing to do. It's a little more expensive, but it's the right thing to do. And the problem with exercise, it makes total sense. You should be able to give loans to employees to exercise. The problem, and here's how it should work. So, if the way that the loan should work is that if you don't exercise the stock, you pay income tax on it. So you pay 40% on it. If you exercise it and hold it for a year, you pay capital gains. So you pay 20. And so what you really should do is everybody should exercise with a loan that splits the difference and gives that 20%. Split it with, get 10% of the value, give it to the loan provider, and the other 10% accrues to the employee. And the only loser is the government, right? They lose out on that 20%, and everybody gets 10%. So you get 10% to the loan provider, 10% to the employee. The problem is underwriting these things is very hard. And so we've actually done this. We've done this for our employees. We rolled out a product for some of our late-stage customers to do employee stock options. But the loan provider has to underwrite these companies, and it's very hard to underwrite startups, particularly on a debt instrument, right? Like, we're not debt people. Like, it's really amazing. Like, if you think about it, the entire world runs on debt. Like, you have credit cards, you have home loans, you've got, everything you do is on debt. But in the venture world, everything's equity. Like, you can't get a loan. I can't get a loan against my Carta stock, right? Like, everything's based on equity. And so finding financing at scale to do these things, to underwrite these companies as debt instruments, has actually, for us, has been proved really, really hard. So we haven't been able to solve that. Your second question of, well, just let them sell the stock, right? The problem is, if you're, the CEO of a Series A or B company, you don't want your employees selling stock. Like, I actually have this problem. I have employees that want to sell stock. I don't let them. They're all locked up. And the reason why is, in this capital market, what happens if I need money for the company? Like, I need to finance the company. I need to raise $100 million for Carta. But now I've got all these employees that are out there trying to sell stock, and I'm competing against my own employees for capital. And that's why venture works. That's why it's illiquid. It's because, by definition, venture-backed companies are capital-starved companies that are constantly going to market to get capital, and the only competition we have on that capital is our own shareholders. So we don't let them sell. And that's why your company won't let you sell, and that's why I don't even let my employees sell. And I'm a progressive on liquidity. And so it's a very tough balance, and that's why liquidity only happens in bull markets, where everybody has full balance sheets and we don't care anymore. But now that capital is constrained, we care a lot about who gets to sell and who we have to compete with for capital.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we've...
This has been an amazing session. I want to riff off a few themes that you all have talked about. First is also a Carta customer, Andrew Brown. He's great, doing fund admin. And then there is a veteran at Carta, Addison McLam, and I think he's actually in attendance. And then the veteran that you all hired several years ago, Brian Webb, is the person who's like, hey, I think he's a veteran. He doesn't talk about it, but you might want to look into Henry Ward's background. And then Craig mentioned the swag. Yes, instead of their swag is not stock options, it's sock options. And so my kids wear them, and they find it very, especially the old logo, the blue ones, they love that sock, and they wear it around school, and their classmates are like, what are you doing? I thought this was one of the best sessions, but I was remarking with Brendan, teammate at Context. Sometimes successful people sound smart, and is it because they're successful, or are they successful because they're smart? And so I'm not sure, but this was, regardless, one of the best.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.